Good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to the FPA next virtual event. It is a pleasure to be here with you and welcome you to the Trade and Covid Today and Tomorrow event. My name is Koen Beer. I'll be the moderator and commentator for today. I would like to start by giving a short introduction and also a bit of an overview on how the webinar will look like. I think maybe first of all to say it's a very timely event. First of all, because we have a lot of discussions at the moment about trade and supply chains, and the moment to start also become more forward-looking is here, and we see that in a lot of the policy discussions that are taking place. At the same time, it is also interesting historically that to the month 90 years ago, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act became law in the US in 1930 with the intention to create jobs by keeping out a lot of imports. We know what happened at that time, and it serves as maybe an interesting educative reminder of the importance of creating strong and good policies also for the post-COVID time. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists for you for today. That is, first of all, Hugh Pullen, Vice President, Global Policy and External Affairs at Merck. And he will say a bit about global bottlenecks and current challenges to supply, followed by Frederick Eriksson, Director of ESIPE, talking a bit about the multilateral trade dimension and global supply chains. We have with us from the US, David Talbot, Senior Director, International Government Affairs from Lilly, talking about the relevance of the EU-US relationship with respect to the fight against COVID-19. And the fourth speaker is Charles Faid, Director Global Policy for Pfizer, talking about the conditions of trade as an engine for EU recovery post-COVID. Before passing the floor to Hugh for some short introductory remarks, maybe a few practical elements. For the over 200 participants to this webinar, could I please ask you all, when you have questions, because we would very much welcome any questions that you have, to send those via the Q&A button on the Zoom facility. If you have any problems with IT login, we have IT support available. You can just write via the general chat. This enables the panelists and us to see the questions and answer adequately. I would like to finally ask all the panelists to be concise in their responses because time is short, and we'd like to answer as many of the questions of the participants as possible. Having said that, maybe Hugh, I can pass the floor to you for a short set of introductory remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Koen, and glad to be here today. So, speaking from the perspective of Merck, a 352-year-old company, I think it's safe to say that COVID-19 has brought levels of complexity that we have never encountered before. I'd like to kick off the discussion with just two key points. I think one, global supply chains, in our view, are really essential to maximize production of medicines, of essential goods, when demand is much higher than supply. So as Merck, we have a network of 18 sites across the world manufacturing our medicines. And this is part of a global strategy by Merck to really build resilience and manage risk. And we've been able to maintain continuity in our operations really through three key levers. One is kind of robust business continuity plans right across our networks. Two is really active and focused management of our stocks globally. And three is really identifying alternative transportation routes to make sure that we can continue to reach our customers and ultimately patients. In many fields, including medicines and personal protective equipment, PPE, we've seen dynamic flows of goods. In the early stages of the pandemic, goods moving from China, from Europe, from Germany towards China. when the outbreak was at its start. And then as the situation evolved, those flows have really reversed, and we've seen these continue to evolve. Another thing is a survey of FPM member companies showed an increase in production for some products of around 260%. This indicates that, at least for our industry, there's real strength and resilience in our manufacturing capacity. So this is my first message. A flexible and responsive global supply chain is actually an asset in a crisis like this. My second point is to say, let's make sure that we actually diagnose the problem correctly before looking for solutions. And indeed, there have been shortages of specific, not from my company, but there have been shortages of specific products in some countries. But if we actually look at why and how these came about, it's generally been one or more of three things. One is export bans or other measures that are really sort of restricting supply or manufacture of medicines. These disrupt distribution channels, they hold back clinical trials, they lead to imbalances between supply and demand, and they risk retaliatory measures from trading partners. And these all have knock-on effects for patients in other countries. Two, stockpiling requirements that too often are not based on sound epidemiological data. And thirdly has been the use of drugs off-label, which is to say the use of a drug outside the condition for which it's been authorized. Now, that's fully understandable in the context of a global health emergency like this, but it does lead to unpredictable spikes in demand. Let's be clear that production location is not the key issue here. For the innovative medicines industry, the EU produces 76% of active ingredients, APIs, domestically. We import 12% from the US and only 9% from all of Asia, which includes Korea and Japan. So Europe is not at the mercy of third countries for its medicines. And I think this is my second big point. Instead, we need to be looking at measures to increase the flexibility and resilience of our global supply chains, drawing on what we've already learned from this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Very interesting points. I'm sure that will lead to several questions. But let's first go to Frederick Eriksson from ESIPE to say a little bit about the multilateral context.
Thank you, Koen, and thank you for inviting me. What I'm going to say is actually going to link up almost immediately from what you just said, which is that when you are looking at sort of the crisis right now, and when you look at different sort of trade policy measures that were introduced, we can see that there is a clear effect coming from restrictive instruments like export curbs, which has a knock-on effect on the production capacity generally. And they tend to work in opposition to the general objective, of course, in a crisis, which is that we want to have trade policies and trade rules which helps to stimulate more production so we can make sure that hospitals and patients will, and staff in hospitals and healthcare centers will get access to whatever protective equipment, whatever medicine, whatever medical technology they need in order to serve their patients. But the restrictive instruments like export curbs had the opposite effect, and they became initially during the crisis very problematic for countries that didn't have stockpiles or didn't have any capacity at all to readjust its own production. But then we had the positive instruments that also came, which was that we saw suspensions of tariffs on a lot of medical goods, not for pharmaceuticals, because we have, for most of global trade, we have a 0-for-0 agreement, which at least deals with the tariff costs for the dominant part of existing trade. But for medical goods, we didn't have that. And the EU, for instance, decided pretty late in March, or in April, I think it was, to suspend tariffs, which led to, again, much greater easiness for governments to procure the medical equipment that they needed and that they were short on. And I think what this basically points to is about the importance to look at policies to assist rather than to stand in the way for positive market coordination when we enter the period of a crisis. Make sure that the supply chains are going to work, because just as you said, it's just impossible to think that we could build resilience if every government was going to have facilities to produce for themselves. We need to have sort of a market solution where we have coordination between governments and between firms to ensure that markets respond very quick to demand. My second point is looking at initiatives that can achieve that. As I said earlier, we already have a zero for zero agreement on pharmaceuticals that gradually have been expanded a bit since 1995 when it was first introduced. I think now is a good time to begin to think much more broadly about medical goods and making sure that anything that is necessary for hospitals to work properly, that we take away the tariffs, and that we also introduce better rules for that restrict sort of the abilities of governments to take very drastic measures that have serious consequences for other countries in a term of crises. Medical goods it's a huge value to the global economy. It represents, I'd say, sort of more than $600-700 billion US dollars in total. So a significant part of global trade, which means that if we move ahead with a tariff eliminating negotiations there, that's going to have very, very positive effects. So that's what I like to see. More of these type of initiatives, and why shouldn't the EU be the first one to take this initiative now after the crisis? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frederick, for these points. Going from the multilateral setting that you just highlighted a little bit, as well as the coordination issue globally, to one that occupies a lot of minds in Europe, which is the bilateral relationship with the United States. Hugh, you mentioned that 12% of the active ingredients actually for Europe do come from the US, so that makes the US an important partner. David, can I give you the floor to say a few elements on the EU-US relationship in relation to COVID-19?
Well, thanks. I think it's rather obvious to state that we have a lot in common at this particular time. The industry has been working around the clock to make sure that the global supply chains remain operational on both sides of the Atlantic and around the world. And there's been unprecedented cooperation and collaboration within industry, with governments, with regulators, foundations, to make sure that the treatments, vaccines, and diagnostics are being developed at a breakneck pace. And there's been no discussion about who gets the credit, only a race to find those solutions. This includes sharing a lot of information between regulators, which may not get front page news, and I think this is good news. In terms of area of concern, I'll echo what you said. The original news that we were reading at the beginning of the crisis about shortages of PPE and ventilators and other medical equipment have led to a lot of tensions transatlantically and around the world. And obviously, we've been spending a lot of time as companies and as industries around the world as well, making sure that measures are not put into place that would affect the global supply chain in general. A couple of things to remember. We are, as an industry, are not reliant on any one country for APIs, as per Hugh's point. We have a global supply chain, and there's a reason for that. That geographic diversity is essential. Enables us to access the resources we need and make adjustments to avoid disruptions in production. We've seen that geographic diversity work incredibly well during this crisis, despite massive challenges, including to the safety of our workforce in terms of getting them into plants to be able to continue to make medicine, but also in terms of distribution. It's, I think, misunderstood somewhat that a lot of the shipping of medicines around the world takes place on commercial airlines. And when those airplanes are not flying, it creates an awful lot of challenges in terms of how do we get medicines to where they are. And our manufacturing and distribution supply chains have done an amazing job adapting to that. So these drastic policy changes that have been proposed, I think, are something that we're obviously concerned about on both sides of the Atlantic. And we continue to talk to government to not only establish the fact base that you you outlined, which is API in large measure does not come from the places that are being discussed. The threat to that, if you look at where API comes into the United States from, the largest source of that is Europe. And the United States ships a lot of product back. And we're also the source in Europe in particular of a huge trade surplus. And so I think we need to do everything we can to maintain that. But in a transatlantic sense, I think the important thing to remember is that we need to work together as governments with policymakers to make sure that the competitive advantage that has existed in our sector for many years continues to be reinforced through that transatlantic relationship, despite tensions that have been created pre this crisis and have continued as well. I was happy to see some language that has been discussed in terms of ongoing collaboration. Obviously, the trade environment with between the EU and US is a little tense right now, and the negotiations with the UK add some complexity to that. But we continue to reinforce with the US government how important that global supply chain is, and reinforce also where the reality actually sits.
Thank you very much, David. I'm sure we'll come to talk a bit more about that in a moment. But before we do that, can I please give the floor to Charles to say a bit about some of the trade elements and conditions as an engine for EU recovery post-COVID. Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Koen. So building on some of the points some of the other speakers have already made, I'd like to turn, as you say, towards the role of and the need for an effective trade policy looking forward. So obviously trade policy has to be a central engine for any sustainable recovery, and much as the hunt for any vaccine is steeped in international cooperation, the economic path to recovery has to be too. So whether that's through the WTO, as Frederick's already highlighted, or the G20, the G7, bilaterally through the EU's trade agenda, more cooperation between governments and with industry is really vital. It's not a zero-sum game, and I think that dialogue really helps to reinforce that point. And we do need these kind of words and these ideas turned into actions. But beyond this kind of underpinning, there are some really important short and longer term areas to focus on. So most immediately, the points made briefly about rolling back export bans, that's really critical, alongside trying to tackle things like forced localization. Beyond that, it's in everyone's interest also to focus on the positive agenda we've heard about, so tariff liberalization, trade facilitation measures. These are really critical from our supply colleagues. We do hear this all the time. The little details, getting them right to enable products to cross borders is absolutely vital at this time. And stepping back a little bit, I think the debate has also been framed a lot about vulnerabilities, and perhaps understandably so in the current context. But turning back to some of the words earlier, it's also important to look at it through the lens of existing points of resilience. And first of all, in this, it's the conditions needed for Europe's manufacturing as part of global supply chains, but particularly for its export base and being able to scale that up globally. So EU medicines exports have been a source of resilience in the past from an economic point of view, post 2008 and the financial crisis, with steady increase of exports, then again as part of global supply chains. And that's borne out by the figures we've heard about, the API figures already, but also the economic data when the EU 27, I think, accounts for about 60% of global exports of finished medicines. And one takeaway from that, I think it's really important, is that patients globally depend on Europe, and that comes with a certain sense of responsibility for everyone involved. So given this, focusing on the conditions for trade now, so stronger global partnerships, removing these barriers and delays in supply chains is vital, but I think it has to be done with an eye on the longer term. So it's not just ensuring that the supply of medical goods for everyone now, as well as hopefully soon enough vaccines, and that's globally to all patients, but also to drive that recovery in Europe and globally. And I think even stepping back further than that, what's really important in terms of the real fundamentals is to enable the kind of medical innovation to allow this to happen, so we can actually tackle the threats of COVID-19. And that Europe needs to have a dynamic and well-funded research ecosystem. So that's longer-term investment in research and development, skills, networks, the health data, infrastructures, important and effective regulatory framework, but really critically having a supportive intellectual property framework, IP. IP's already played a really important role in the crisis so far. The development we've seen of over 130 potential options and treatments. This will take time. It's an unprecedented number in such a short time scale, and that's a really positive story to take so far. But without intellectual property, many of these treatment options, potential options, would not exist. So when we're looking at the issues of strategic resilience, and the international competitive position of Europe is really critical in this, but it's not just a question of manufacturing. It's a question of being able to scale up solutions and drive the economic recovery. And that's also very much embedded in having the right R&D and innovation framework in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. That concludes our kind of first round of initial comments. Thank you very much to the panelists. We note that questions are coming in. And just a reminder, if you do so, please use the Q&A button on the screen so that we can process them also towards the panelists and myself as moderator. Maybe going back for a moment, Hugh, to you first. You mentioned the issues of export bans, stockpiling, and off-label, let's say, as a factors why there are challenges with global supply. But just to challenge you a little bit, isn't also let's say the current supply chain complexity that it is so complex? One of the reasons why we have some of these challenges is one of the points, and to what extent indeed do we also see that in the pharmaceutical industry?
No, I think it's a fair question, Koen. But I think what you've heard, not just from me, but from the other panelists, is that really diversification across geographies actually builds resilience into the supply chain. I mean, clearly there are complexities. And if you just take biologic medicines, which require very scientifically advanced production, in some cases, you need to manufacture at a single site because that is needed for reasons of quality, reasons of consistency, and so on. But I think, again, let's be clear about where the real problems are. And, there's no salvation in having diversified production, or indeed in concentrating production, if in Europe delivery trucks meet 80-kilometer lines at border crossings, for example. I guess my other question is, can we use the crisis? I mean, devastating crisis, but can we see a way out of this to really accelerate change? So some of the things that Charles was referring to, but also other examples. So moving to accelerate trade facilitation, moving to electronic signatures for export certificates, all sorts of things that we can do. But I think let's look at ways in which we can really recognize the crisis we're in and use that to really accelerate and drive change. I think the last thing I would say is that we as an industry have been very fortunate to have these weekly virtual meetings with European commissioners, European officials, to raise and really sort of discuss a lot of these issues. And I think that dialogue has been really critical in helping, first of all, to unblock some of these issues that we've been referring to, but I think also to recognize where you can accelerate change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Hugh. Frederick, if I may turn to you for a moment, one of the questions that came in is really about, it's interesting that you say there is a possibility to look at the WTO context, but we also see increased pressures on localization in many industries, among others, the pharmaceutical industry. The WTO is paralyzed with the appellate body discussion. So what role do you see for the WTO or the EU via the WTO to be an effective player in looking at helping the post-COVID recovery realistically?
No, you're absolutely right, Koen, that given the state of the WTO right now, I don't think anyone is expecting a big change. You referred in your introductory remarks to the smooth Hawley tariffs coming 90 years ago, and perhaps it's a coincidence that another Hawley, Josh Hawley, proposed to the US Congress this week that America is going to pull out of the World Trade Organization. So you're right, it's not having sort of a good time generally. But there are a lot of things you can do without engaging the entire membership. There are a lot of things you can do plurilaterally together with other governments. But I think my main point would basically be that one of the problems that the World Trade Organization has suffered from over the past 15, 20 years is that many of the negotiations haven't really had the intention of resolving specific market access problems that are so significant that they can motivate political change. And I think right now we are in such a situation where it's perfectly obvious that when we are confronted with a crisis like this, trade policy also needs to play its part in order to create much better conditions for companies, the private sector, hospitals and others to get supply chains, value chains to work and make sure that there are not restrictions in the way, which is going to have a bad negative effect on all of us. So I think sort of, even if it's not going to be in Geneva, I don't think it's going to sort of to be problematic to find lots of governments in the world that have made the same observation as the European Commission has done, which is that we had lots of restrictions that made it harder for the private sector to accelerate production and for governments, local governments and hospitals to get access to all the important equipments, pharmaceuticals they needed in this crisis. So it's a good opportunity to use and a perfect opportunity for the European Commission to basically lead. To now that they've suspended tariffs on medical goods, they have lots of interest to go ahead with an expansion of the pharmaceutical agreement that existed in the past. So they can go ahead and act.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think that's an interesting invitation, and maybe depending on the questions, we can come back to that for a moment. One question came in for David. David, someone asks, there is clearly a tension between the US and the rest of the world at the moment. Does who gets the vaccine first? Does that depend on where it's being developed?
Well, I should caveat this by saying we are not a vaccine manufacturer, but I think in general, I think you can see a sense of cooperation amongst the industry globally, which understands the scale of the challenge and the fact that the spotlight is considerably upon us. And I don't think it's in anyone's best interest in our sector to be isolating certain regions of the world from where this production of any therapeutic or vaccine, or for that matter, diagnostics, are distributed. So I think that there's a conscious effort on behalf of the leaders in the industry to make sure that we are finding ways to produce as much of a successful vaccine or a therapeutic or some selection of them. I think we're looking obviously at probably a wide range of solutions to this problem and not one magic bullet. And making sure it gets as far and wide as possible. So we realize that there's a lot of concern, which was sort of led by this PPE discussion at the beginning of the crisis, which has led to a lot of tension and rhetoric about who's going to get what first. But those who are responsible for producing this are not thinking in that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much, David. Another question that comes in, and maybe I can ask Charles to give a short response, and given the background Hugh as well, because some of you reacted to this. The question is, do you see challenges or barriers in the digital architecture around the world, for example, in streamlining supply chains as being a problem in kind of streamlining this distribution and supply, as some of you indeed have suggested? Maybe Charles, I can ask you, and then a short response from Hugh.
I mean, I briefly got, yeah, I'm not close enough to the operational side of it to have a clear answer, but I think the discussions that we've had, I think at industry level and elsewhere, is very much that digital is going to be at the forefront of any recovery more broadly. And in some ways, you know, the fact that we're using this forum here means that I think a lot of the fundamentals are being relooked at for you know, and that would include on supply chains. I think Europe does have some, you know, infrastructure in place that could ultimately be of use in that. I'm thinking of the European Medicines Verification System. There is an architecture in place which isn't designed primarily for this. It's designed for tackling the really important threat of counterfeit medicines. But you know, a collaboration with all the parties involved in that may also potentially be one area to look at in the digital context for supply chains in making sure that we have as much efficiency and transparency of supply chains as possible.
Yeah, just a couple of words on this as well. I mean, I think just taking a step back and looking at it more broadly, I think there's a real opportunity here to drive digital transformation. I think what we saw prior to COVID was very different regulatory approaches being taken between the US, China, and Europe on digital matters. I think there may be a forced rethink of that, particularly in Europe, if you just look at the context of the exit strategies and the use of apps as part of those exit strategies. I think this is certainly forcing a kind of a reevaluation of how we manage digital issues. I think if you put that in a trade context, what does it mean? It means looking at how regulatory frameworks might need to evolve immediately in the context of the crisis, but whether that then leads to something which is longer term and a sort of convergence of approaches towards regulation of digital technologies. So I think it's very early days to say how this is going to evolve, but I think you have the potential to see a sort of convergence of what were quite different regulatory approaches globally on some of these issues.
One interesting, and maybe I jump a question a little bit because it's a little bit linked to the answer you just gave. Maybe can you say a bit about how, or one of the panelists, how pharmaceutical companies receive their data, and is there any data that's missing in order to kind of be better addressing needs that happen on the demand side from a supply perspective?
I can say a couple of words on this. I mean, I think there is a clear recognition, at least within Europe, that yes, we don't have the full picture in terms of supply. I mentioned some of the issues earlier that we've been dealing with, particularly in the context of the COVID crisis, around export bans, supply disruptions, simply holdups at borders and so on, which make it very hard to keep a very accurate overview of where the need is and where need is not being fulfilled. And I mentioned off-label use, which can lead to real sort of demand spikes as well, coupled with, in the case of chronic conditions, patients effectively being given 2 or 3 months worth of prescriptions to fulfill at a pharmacy, which leads to great deal of unpredictability in the supply. So I think it's an issue that we are collectively addressing as an industry. Charles mentioned the European Medicines Verification System. There are technologies in place which I think if we, in dialogue with the other supply chain stakeholders and with the regulatory bodies, can work effectively to really leverage these, then I think we have a much better chance of having a clear picture of where the actual demand for medicines is and matching that with supply. So I think we have tools in place, but they're not really being used effectively at this stage, I would say.
Thank you, Hugh. If I jump for a moment to Charles, one question came in for you about there has been an intense focus on moving API manufacturing back to Europe as an answer to shortages for medicines in Europe. Do you agree with that?
Sorry, just coming off mute there. So, I mean, it's an important question, and I think as we've probably heard before, I think that the key thing is understanding the data. And I think from the perspective of the innovative industry, it's a fairly clear picture that already over 3/4 of API production for Europe is in Europe. And you know, the next largest tranche by a good distance is from the US. So that's covering, you know, nearly 90% of global API supply for innovative medicine. So I think it's already there in many ways. There's obviously a very, you know, complex crossover of different products and different supply chains. But I think, you know, if it's going to come back, it has to, you know, it'll be about the right economic conditions for that as well. So I think I'd really just focus more on the data and identifying what the needs are as a key driver for that.
Thank you very much, Charles. I think that is very useful. David, a question came in for you on do you believe that the US will take all of the remdesivir that is being produced for the US first before exporting anything elsewhere?
Well, again, we don't manufacture that particular pharmaceutical, but I think from what I have read, the company has made it very clear that they're trying to get as much of that produced for the world as possible. I know that this has been a general concern based on the behavior of various governments that we've seen based on shortages of different products at the beginning of this crisis. But we think that the global solution to the problem is entirely necessary. We are a global industry, and I think our focus is on trying to race to find solutions as quickly as possible. And we know that this one particular product has been identified as being something that could be helpful in certain types of COVID-19 patients. There's more to come. And when those appear to be safe and effective, companies are looking at ways of scaling up production to give as broad access around the world as possible. And I think that that's the driving force behind the motivation for our industry, despite what some of the rhetoric we may hear in the news has to say. The intent of the industry is for there to be a global solution to this problem.
Thank you, David. We get a question in from Ashley Furlong. There are calls for the pooling of COVID-19 related IP, technology, therapeutics, etc., to ensure that there is equitable access to products and technologies that will help address the crisis. What does industry think of these calls? Hugh, may I ask you to answer that question?
Yes, thanks. I mean, let's be clear. So IP must not be a barrier to making treatments available to COVID patients, wherever they are. I think the industry is, and I think we've all said this, we're all aligned on this, industry is really committed to working with governments and other partners to make these treatments available and affordable for patients that need them wherever they are in the world. And there are various initiatives. So there's proposals, as you said, for voluntary pooling of intellectual property assets, including the sort of the medicines patient patent pool, to temporarily expand its mandate to include health technologies related to COVID, and I think that's important. I think the other thing that I would say is that there has been heavy R&D investment over many years, which means that we start really with multiple options. And so what you see, remdesivir, what you see vaccines, really the development timelines moving from years or even decades to months, and that's all based on sort of private R&D investment, which has been made over many years, and that's underpinned by sound intellectual property protection. So yes, I think as an industry, we are prepared to really explore all the options and to make sure that we're working with governments and all other partners to make sure that IP is not and will not be a barrier to making sure that everyone gets treatments as soon as they become available.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I have here also a question for Frederick. You may, of course, you focused a bit on the multilateral setting in terms of the impact. The question is what your kind of advice would be to the European Commission in terms of its bilateral trade strategy and how to use that as an sort of, it said here, offensive instrument in the EU's, let's say, strategic post-COVID recovery, and what elements you think would matter in that strategy?
Yes, thank you. Well, there are a number of things that the EU is doing already on the bilateral front. There are currently sort of negotiations going on with countries like Australia and New Zealand, for instance. And they sort of come sort of on the back of the EU having been, you know, pretty successful over the past 10 years to negotiate bilateral agreements with many significant markets in the world. I don't sort of keep a tally on the number of FTAs that we've done, but sort of we're already covering many countries. There are a couple of gaps in that sort of painting of existing EU FTAs. And they are the notable ones. So we don't have an FTA with America. We don't have one with China. We don't have one with India. There are several Southeast Asian economies as well. So to the extent that we can put a lot more emphasis on the FTA agenda, I think they sort of, that points us in the obvious direction. And my advice would be sort of to start with America. And if not doing sort of an equivalent to the ambitions that existed for TTIP, so at least start by building on what has already been done and focus on some of the stuff that we've been talking about here, where we can use trade policy to become an assistance helping resolving practical problems that we've seen during this crisis. So I think a lot of things can be done there. And for the entire medical industry, including sort of PPE producers, pharmaceuticals, producers of medical equipment, we are largely talking about firms that are highly anchored transatlantically, and where there is sort of a very strong alignment between industry in what type of policies that can be pushed and that would have a material effect. So it's not that we're talking about two different sides where one part of the industry thinks sort of they want to have more openness and another part of the industry think they want less openness. This is sort of I'd say broadly a sector where there is very strong alignment between the industry on all sides. So that would be sort of a good start. Then the other part could be sort of to build on the existing network of FTAs and make sure that they get updated with necessary components that the crisis now have highlighted. And we can see sort of broadly sort of in healthcare, medical goods, that there are a couple of gaps that exist in some of these FTAs. We can also see, I mean, coming into the discussion that you had previously on data, that's another field where there are more things that can be done on data regulations to ensure that we don't sort of put up unnecessary blocks where privacy issues is not going to be at risk here. And there are plenty of situations like that for the entire medical industry. So that could be another advice then, to basically review existing FTAs with the view of updating them.
Thank you very much. Frederick, if I may jump for a second. Yes, Charles?
Could I just jump in on that point and some of the points that Frederick's just made about you know, what EU trade policy can do and the US angle, and a fairly, I think, tangible example of something that's been really helpful already, and I think promises to be in the sort of in the coming months and years, and that's the EU-US Mutual Recognition Agreement, the MRA, on pharmaceutical manufacturing practice. That's one of the only things that effectively came out of or was linked indirectly to the TTIP negotiations. What's important there is that it's introduced a couple of things, one of which is an agreement to reduce import testing measures. for products being imported into the European Union from the US, depends on them being recognised having the same quality level of manufacturing. What that actually means is that you're effectively able, once that's implemented, and I think companies in the US, manufacturing sites are implementing that now, is that you're able to take off around 30 to 60 days of supply time that will be there for imports. So you're injecting that kind of flexibility into supply chains. And moving forward, that's going to be really important to have that necessary agility. So the MRA has said it's been fully in place since July last year. And there are discussions going on about potentially expanding that to include vaccines. This is a really important area, and I think these kind of initiatives are potentially already going to bear fruit. The other flip side of that is it's really important to make sure that you don't lose those regulatory alignments. So mutual recognition agreement, I think in the context of the EU, UK discussions will also be very important. So you don't almost reimpose the kind of 30, 60 day timeline back into supply chains. So I just leave those couple of points where we do actually also already see some very important mechanisms for supporting patient supply.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charles. A lot of questions are coming in. We thank you a lot for that. I'm gonna try to ask the speakers to be concise so we can cover several more. David, the question for you was, in the EU, there are several ways and timelines for regulatory approvals. In the US, there is a concise scheme with the FDA that seems to be faster in terms of aligned approvals. The question is, will EMA, you think, have more should EMA have more opportunities to align to a one-size-fits-all approach in order to also speed up that approval process?
I think we've seen movement from the EMA to try and have a emergency approval pathway that is a little quicker. I mean, I think the situation that as an industry we want to avoid is there being a new therapeutic or vaccine approved in one region of the world and not in others, because that will exacerbate a couple of the challenges that have been addressed in other questions about equitable distribution. So I think that there's a race, quite frankly, and I think it's a healthy one, and hopefully one that we will build upon after this crisis, which is how do regulators look at their processes, focused, of course, because of the crisis, but how do we improve the speed of these regulatory reviews while maintaining very high safety standards? So we've seen a lot of action and movement from regulators around the world. The FDA has been incredibly quick at turning things around, as you've seen probably from the news. EMA has also developed a lot of pathways to try and get some of these promising therapeutics into the clinic faster. And hopefully, if we end up getting a group of therapeutics or one therapeutic that looks particularly valuable, that it'll be approved quickly and something that we can then produce as much as possible and get to worldwide distribution.
Thank you, David. I think that's an important one. Charles, following up on the answer you just gave in terms of the timelines, someone asked if I'm allowed to mention the B word, Brexit, in a no-deal scenario. How complicated could it be to secure the flow of medicines and health technologies throughout Europe if the UK is completely outside the regulatory regime?
So it's definitely going to add, and I think the whole discussion around Brexit is obviously framed around the reimposition of trade barriers and the logical consequence of that. So that's definitely there. There are certain aspects to it, I think, and there's obviously a lot of unknowns to it. The customs area is certainly one of those, and making sure that that to the extent possible within FTA arrangements for customs allow for as smooth flow of medicines, critical goods as possible. Obviously, particularly we can expect if we're in a situation at the end of this year, the COVID situation will not have gone away by then. I think the other point, back to the mutual recognition agreement, is that it's kind of there is a significant flow of medicines going from the UK into the EU. It's obviously dwarfed the other way around, but it's still a very significant amount. You're essentially, by not having a mutual recognition agreement in place, if you're adding those import testing requirements, that's potentially adding a significant time to get those medicines to European patients. And so that's a real issue. I think that the UK authorities perhaps have waived those requirements going the other way. So I think it's a really important element to that, and it talks to the need to try and get some kind of solution, particularly in that space.
A follow-up question on that just came in, Charles. Maybe if I may, that is understood, but it's also clear that the EU has political considerations, and they cannot extend the internal market to the UK if the talks are about a free trade agreement type of deal. How would you see that?
Well, it's absolutely not a single market instrument. I mean, we're talking about it's a bilateral agreement that the EU has with other countries. It's obviously worked to assess the levels of GMP compliance based on global standards through this body PICS. So it's the same mechanism that exists with other trade agreements. Obviously, there is a very clear sort of political dynamic to that, and which adds layers of complexity to it. So we're well aware of that. There's a bigger picture piece to it, but I think necessarily we're happy to look at this as industry in Europe and the other side of the channel as well. That we need to find some kind of a solution in that context.
Thank you, Charles. Hugh, there is a question for you. With COVID, the inspection of facility is being blocked because of the travel restrictions. How do you see that other mechanisms could work, or could we come up with any other mechanisms in order to make sure that we still have necessary inspections to ensure the quality of production taking place?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two parts to this. One is short-term, finding pragmatic solutions and recognizing that that sort of understandable concerns in the context of COVID can, in terms of protecting people from infection, can have much longer and deeper long-term consequences. So I think working pragmatically to find solutions for specific inspections is really important. I think the longer term piece is that some of the approaches that are being trialed in this context, such as virtual or at a distance inspections, and these are being tried out in various contexts. If these are successful, then we could see ways to reduce regulatory burden in the future. So I think it's partly about finding pragmatic solutions right now, but partly, as I was saying before as well, about how can we take the very best out of this huge crisis that we're all facing and use it to improve processes and systems for the future. Sorry, Koen, you're muted.
Apologies. Thank you, Hugh. Charles, there was one more question for you. It says standards for medical equipment have been made freely available from Europe. Do you see post-COVID further increasing challenges to technical barriers to trade, or do you think there is a willingness for more increased cooperation? I think that links a bit to Hugh's answer before.
I think there has to be increased cooperation in this front. I think the whole question of standards is really critical, and I think it's one of the really important things we've seen is obviously the regulatory flexibilities piece, and recognizing the strong role that governments and regulators have played in the space in this crisis. So I think getting those standards right and having that longer term conversation about what's the opportunity to step back a little bit and understand that better is really key here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. If I may go to David for a moment, there is a question that relates to the EU-US collaboration. Do you believe that the current pandemic has the future to impact US trade policy in becoming again more open, and especially with respect to Europe? And what role do you see for the pharmaceutical industry to facilitate a positive engagement between the two?
Again, an easy question then. I would say, the discussion over trade with this administration has been different from previous administrations. I think that's sort of a no-brainer. You will see that the administration continues to pursue trade deals with various trading partners. There'll be one name that's sort of excluded from this list, but they include Japan, China, the UK, Brazil, Kenya, and others. And so there's a real interest continuing from the Trump administration in negotiating trade agreements with those countries. I think the tension between the US and the EU has continued to be something that I know the Commissioner Hogan has made a lot of inroads on. He's continuing to dialogue with Ambassador Lighthizer. I know at the staff level, talks continue. I think what we are trying to do as an industry is find ways where that there is the most common interest. And I think what COVID has done in that area is pointed to a lot of regulatory progress that we can make, where the regulators are already talking. They were previously on a number of fronts, but COVID-19 has accelerated that discussion. So can we build upon that as a way of creating momentum for larger discussions around trade? I think so. Is the rhetoric challenging in order to be able to do that on both sides of the Atlantic? Absolutely. But I think there are a lot of things that have come out of this crisis which have helped focus the mind. And if we can start somewhere, like on regulatory cooperation, related to how we've worked together on trying to bring treatments and vaccines to the market as quickly as possible to help address this crisis globally, I think that's a great building block.
Thank you very much. We're nearing the end of the panel. So what I would like to ask each of the panelists to do is give me maybe a very short statement on the one thing that I would say you have learned over the last 8 weeks that is really crucial, you think, in going forward beyond the current pandemic. And I'm asking you also, given time, to really stick to a 1-minute statement before we round off. Hugh, can I give you the floor?
I think for me, the key thing is for the research-based industry. I think we faced, before the pandemic, a lot of very challenging discussions, and I think of the European context, but beyond that, around our role, our contribution to society. I think what is very clear to me is that it's really been an opportunity for us to be very clear about what we bring to society in terms of research and innovation, and really our commitment to work with policymakers and other stakeholders, not only to manage this crisis and all of its very complex dimensions, but really to play a critical role in pandemic preparedness moving forward.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you very much. Frederick, can I ask you for the same question, please?
Absolutely. I think there are many lessons that we have learned. I mean, one for me has been the speed and flexibility of the private sector to respond to a completely different new type of demand, a completely different new type of logistics conditions that exist for actually taking your products, taking your components and reach your customer. I think that has worked much better than I expected. I think there's also a lot of positive example to build on by sort of actions by regulators and by governments. How clear it is that when you reduce the number of restrictions you have, when you start to relax a couple of standards that you use, you will see much faster facilitation of trade. You will see that hospitals and healthcare centers have got access to what they needed in a much better way than expected. So I'd like to sort of build on these positive experiences from this crisis, and hopefully we're going to take those with us into the future.
Thank you very much, Frederick. David, can I give you the floor?
Well, everything that both Frederick and Hugh said, plus I think it's it's difficult to overemphasize how amazing the speed at which both industry and government have come together to try and find solutions for this crisis. The amount of scientific cooperation, the amount of creative thinking, the speed at which molecules and vaccines have gotten into the clinic is breathtaking. And obviously the crisis has required that. I think that people are working together in ways that they have never done so before. And my hope is that we can not only address the challenges that COVID-19 has brought from a flow of goods perspective, but also build upon what we've seen in terms of collaboration for the future. Because if we are going to take anything from this terrible crisis that is positive, it's the ability for us as an industry with government and other partners to move incredibly quickly to try and find a solution. We've never seen cures, vaccines, or other things move as quickly as they have, and hopefully that we can build upon that for the future.
Thank you very much, David. Charles, last but not least.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Ron. I mean, I think a lot has already been said. I'd certainly reiterate them, and certainly I think it's one of my takeaways of the last few months have been the sense of responsibility, in terms of innovation, but really in terms of cooperation. And I think the other thing is just, it sounds quite cheesy, the whole point of global approaches require global problems require global solutions, but that's not just a policy issue. You've seen it in discussion with our supply chain colleagues, on a daily basis, the work and thinking they have to do in this highly complex and challenging environment. And so this overlay is really important. And I think it's also just, alongside the work that we all see of care workers, doctors who are really at the front line, I'd also just like to say, a lot of company manufacturers are doing a huge amount of work. They're going to work every day, ramping up supplies, as Hugh and others have said, in very difficult conditions to make sure that patients get their medicines, not just for COVID, but around the clock for existing needs. And I think just seeing that dedication by supply chain colleagues in different companies is I think really an important takeaway to sort of put people in their place and go, wow, that's impressive work.
Thank you very much, Charles. I would like to thank all of you, Hugh, Frederick, David, Charles. Thank you so much for your insights and your answering the many questions. I would like to thank the participants for sending through so many of the questions. We have not been able to answer all of them. I do apologize for that. So if you still want, feel free to let us know, and we would be happy to still answer in writing the questions we couldn't address with you during this panel. We have reached the 3 o'clock mark exactly. I just wanted to make one last comment, and it is that we have, of course, recorded this event that will be available, so you can also see it at a later stage back. Thank you very much, and we hope to continue this discussion with you in the future.